Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched it in the comments. Elias Ward rode along the riverbank in the late afternoon, guiding his tired horse through patches of frozen grass and muddy ground. The wind pushed steadily from the north, carrying the cold bite of the season deeper into the valley. He was returning from checking his trap lines, one of the few tasks that kept him occupied on the land he managed alone. Life on the frontier had stripped him down to simple routines. Keep the cabin standing, keep food on the table, keep to himself. It was easier that way. After losing his family in a raid years earlier, he had stopped expecting anything from the world and settled in an isolated stretch of land where no one asked questions. He preferred silence. Silence didn't betray him. As he followed the curve of the river, the wind shifted, carrying with it a sound he wasn't expecting. A short, sharp cry, human, strained by cold and panic. Elias stiffened, pulling the reins to slow his horse. He listened again, holding his breath. The noise came once more, faint but urgent, blending with the rushing water. Someone was fighting the current. He dismounted quickly, boots slipping on wet stones as he moved toward the river. For a moment he saw nothing but the violent churn of half-frozen water. Then a splash of movement caught his eye. A woman's arm, the top of her dark hair, the frantic motion of someone who had been fighting far too long. She was being dragged downstream, her body hitting submerged rocks as she tried to keep her face above water. Elias felt his pulse spike, a sudden burst of adrenaline tightening his chest. This wasn't the kind of trouble he normally stepped into. But walking away was impossible. He had seen people drown before. He knew how quickly the river could claim a life. His mind moved fast. He stripped off his coat, tossed his gloves aside, and stepped into the freezing water before fear could talk him out of it. The cold hit him like a hard blow. His muscles tensed instantly, but he pushed forward, using the force of the current to reach her. She went under right as he got close, her hands slipping beneath the surface. Elias lunged deeper, grabbed her arm, and pulled with everything he had. Her body was heavy with soaked deerskin clothing, and her breathing was weak. Her eyes flickered open for a second, dark, confused, exhausted. Apache. He didn't pause. Identity didn't matter. She was dying. He hooked an arm around her waist and fought the current, digging his boots into the rocky bottom until he reached the riverbank. Each breath felt sharp inside his chest, but he kept moving, hauling her onto the ground. She coughed violently, water spilling from her mouth, her body shaking uncontrollably. "Stay with me," he muttered, kneeling beside her. Her gaze darted around, unfocused but alert enough to recognize him as a stranger. Fear settled in her features, the kind that came from a life where trust could get you killed. Elias raised his hand slightly, showing her he meant no harm. "My name's Elias," he said, his voice steady despite the cold. "You're safe. I'm taking you out of this wind." She didn't respond. She couldn't. Her lips were blue, her hands trembling so violently she couldn't grip the ground beneath her. He lifted her carefully, feeling the weight of her limp body against his chest. Each step toward the cabin was heavy and slow, but he pushed through the terrain, driven by an instinct he didn't fully understand. Helping others had once been part of who he was, before war, loss, and isolation hardened him. But this woman was fighting for her life, and something in him refused to let her slip away. Her name, he would later learn, was Ayoka. For now, she was simply a stranger pulled from the edge of death. Inside his cabin, the fire still burned low from the morning. Elias kicked the door shut behind him and lowered her onto a blanket near the stove. Steam rose from their wet clothes as the warmth hit their skin. She opened her eyes a crack, scanning the room with a mixture of fear and confusion. He spoke softly, knowing too much noise might make things worse. "You're safe here. You're freezing. Let me help." He worked quickly, wrapping her in every dry blanket he had, feeding more wood into the stove, and checking the small cut along her arm. His mind stayed focused on tasks, but underneath it all ran a steady current of questions. Who was she? Where was she running from? Why was she alone near a dangerous river at this time of year? He didn't ask. Not yet. She needed warmth before she needed answers. As she shivered violently under the blankets, Elias sat back on his heels, the cold still burning his own skin, and studied her features, the faint bruise along her forehead, the torn beadwork on her deerskin dress, the worn leather around her wrists, signs of struggle, signs of desperation. A quiet thought crossed his mind, one he had learned to ignore over the years. You were meant to be here at the right moment. He pushed it aside. He didn't believe in fate. Not anymore. But as Ioka's breathing steadied and the storm wind pushed against the cabin walls, Elias realized something he couldn't deny. He was responsible for her now, and nothing in his quiet, lonely life had prepared him for what came next. Ayoka's breathing steadied little by little as the heat from the stove filled the cabin. Elias added another log, then knelt beside her again, watching for any sign that she could understand where she was. Her eyelids fluttered as if her body kept drifting between the present moment and the river that had tried to take her. The blankets around her shoulders were already damp from melting frost, so Elias replaced them with dry ones, working carefully to avoid startling her. She opened her eyes fully for the first time. Her gaze moved from the walls to the stove to his face, studying him in a way that was cautious but alert. She did not speak, but she followed his movements closely, as if assessing whether she needed to defend herself. Her breathing hitched when she attempted to sit up. Pain tightened her jaw. Elias steadied her with one hand, light but firm. "Easy," he said quietly. "You hit your arm. You're weak from the cold." Ayoka looked down at her arm, now wrapped in a clean strip of cloth. She touched the bandage gently, her fingers trembling. The injury was not deep, but the shock from nearly drowning had drained every bit of strength she had left. She tried to form a word. Her voice cracked. "Where?" "You're in my cabin," Elias answered. "The river's just outside the valley. I brought you here when you went under." She didn't respond right away, but her expression changed, something between disbelief and uncertainty. She swallowed hard, her throat still raw. Elias noticed how tightly she held the edge of the blanket, her knuckles pale from tension. She was not simply cold. She was afraid. He took a small step back to give her room. Fear, he knew, was not always about the present danger. Sometimes it came from whatever had happened before a stranger found you in a river. Her eyes drifted toward the door as if expecting someone to burst through it. She listened to the storm outside, the wind slamming against the walls. The sound made her flinch. "You're safe here," Elias said, keeping his tone calm and steady. "No one else is coming." Ayoka's attention shifted back to him, lingering on his face long enough to sense the truth in his words. Her breathing slowed again. She whispered something under her breath, quiet enough that Elias couldn't fully catch it, but he recognized the tone, gratitude mixed with hesitation. He moved toward the small shelf beside the stove and poured warm water into a tin cup. When he handed it to her, she hesitated only a moment before accepting it with both hands. The warmth steadied her grip. Her eyes softened. She studied him with less tension now, as if trying to understand the kind of man who would pull a stranger from a river and then keep his distance to avoid frightening her. Elias didn't look away. He wanted to show her she had nothing to fear, even if he wasn't skilled at expressing it. "Drink slow," he said. "Your body's still in shock." She obeyed his instructions, taking small sips. A faint color returned to her face. Elias used that moment to gather the questions he needed to resolve, not out of curiosity, but because they shaped the decisions he would have to make. She had been alone beside a dangerous river during the coldest part of the season. Her dress was torn in more than one place. Her wrist had marks from something that did not come from the river. The circumstances were clear enough. She had been fleeing something or someone, but she wasn't ready to talk about it. He didn't push her. Ayoka finally set the cup down. Her voice was still weak, but steadier than before. "You found me?" she asked. "Yeah. Why?" Elias paused. It was an easy question. Not for him. "You needed help," he said, "and I was close enough to give it." She stared at him for several seconds, as if measuring the sincerity behind the words. He let the silence stay, allowing her to decide how much she wanted to believe. A tremor ran through her shoulders. The warmth was not enough. The shock still clung to her. Elias added one more blanket and adjusted it around her back. She flinched at first, then relaxed when she realized his hands were gentle. Her voice broke again, but the words were clearer this time. "I thought I wouldn't make it." "You almost didn't," Elias said honestly. "But you're here now." The fire snapped loudly, throwing soft light across the room. Ayoka followed the flames with her eyes, grounding herself in the simple rhythm of heat and sound. Elias sat on the chair across from her, close enough to help if she needed it, but far enough not to intimidate her. His own thoughts were sharp despite the calm he projected. A stranger arriving half-drowned in this part of the valley meant trouble nearby. He scanned the room briefly. Rifle in reach, doors secured, horse sheltered. If someone had been chasing her, there was no telling whether they were still in the area. For now, the storm was the only barrier between the cabin and the outside world, and he would use it. Ayoka pressed her hand against her forehead, wincing as the bruise beneath her hairline throbbed. Elias noted the gesture. She had been struck, not simply thrown by the river. Her eyes lifted again. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "Nothing," Elias answered immediately. She blinked, searching his face for any sign of hidden intent. When she found none, her shoulders loosened just slightly. "I'll get you through the night," he said. "When the storm passes, we'll figure out what comes next." Her gaze softened with relief, subtle but unmistakable. The storm rattled the cabin walls again, but the sound no longer made her flinch. Inside the small room, warmth and quiet wrapped around them, creating an uneasy but growing sense of safety. Ayoka's breathing steadied. Her eyes drifted closed, not from fear this time, but from exhaustion. Elias watched over her, knowing she was still fragile and that any danger she carried might not be over. But she was alive, and she was no longer alone. The night ahead would decide the rest. The wind tore through the valley with a force that made the cabin walls shudder. Snow slapped against the shutters in uneven bursts, and the river outside roared under the weight of the rising storm. Inside, the warmth fought to hold its ground, filling the small room with the steady glow of the stove. Ayoka slept under thick blankets, her breathing shallow but even, while Elias sat nearby, sharpening a dull knife out of habit rather than need. He kept his eyes on her more than on the blade. Her earlier questions still echoed in his mind, questions shaped by fear and a life spent watching for danger long before it reached her. People didn't end up alone in icy rivers without reason. He had seen the marks on her wrist, the torn beadwork on her dress, the bruise along her forehead. Those signs didn't come from falling or slipping. Someone had hurt her. Someone might still be looking for her. That possibility tightened something in his chest, something bordering on anger, but fueled more by concern. If danger followed her to the cabin, he needed to be ready. A slight sound pulled his attention, Ayoka stirring beneath the blankets. She opened her eyes slowly, blinking against the dim light. For a moment, she looked unsure of where she was. Then she caught sight of Elias sitting nearby, and her body eased into the recognition that she wasn't alone and wasn't in immediate danger. "How long?" she whispered. "A couple hours," Elias said. "You were freezing. Rest was the only thing keeping your strength up." She pushed herself up with care, wincing at the pain in her arm. Elias reached out to steady the blanket before it slipped from her shoulders. Her skin still held the cold, but her face had color again, faint but growing. Outside, the storm cracked like a distant gunshot. Ayoka flinched, gripping the blanket tighter. "It won't let up tonight," Elias said, watching her eyes move toward the window. Traveling would be more dangerous than staying. Her jaw tensed. The thought of staying anywhere with a stranger clearly unsettled her, yet she had no alternative. She nodded once, accepting the reality even if she didn't like it. Elias stood and moved toward the shelves to prepare something warm. The simple act of standing put him between her and the door, a habit formed from years of protecting his home from anyone who might try the latch without permission. But now he positioned himself deliberately so she wouldn't feel trapped. His movements were steady, predictable, easy to follow with her eyes. He spooned leftover stew into a tin bowl and reheated it on the stove. The scent slowly filled the cabin, meat, potatoes, a handful of herbs he had dried months back. Ayoka watched every step, not out of suspicion, but because her body recognized the smell of food long before she admitted it. When he handed her the bowl, her hands trembled slightly. Hunger worked against exhaustion, but she managed a few slow bites. Warmth spread through her face. Her shoulders relaxed. Elias sat a short distance away. "Do you remember what happened before the river?" he asked, keeping his tone low to avoid sounding demanding. She swallowed hard, her gaze shifting away from him. Her fingers tightened around the bowl. He expected silence, but after several seconds she spoke. "There were men," she said quietly. "Not from my people. They stopped my path. One struck me. I ran." Elias didn't interrupt. She needed time to decide how much she wanted to reveal. "I followed the river to escape them," she continued. "I thought it would hide my tracks." The truth explained a great deal: the injuries, the fear, the urgency. It also confirmed Elias's suspicion that danger wasn't far behind her. "Did they see which way you went?" he asked. She shook her head. "I don't know. The water took me before I understood anything else." Her voice shook at the memory. Elias kept his posture steady, letting her read the calm in him. She searched his expression for judgment, pity, or fear of trouble. She found none. "You're safe here," he said. "Storm like this will cover any tracks. No one could follow through that wind." Ayoka lowered the bowl in her lap, letting out a long, uneven breath. Relief crossed her face for the first time since she opened her eyes in the cabin. She wasn't free of worry, but she wasn't fighting to survive anymore. Elias gathered more firewood and stacked it near the stove. She watched him with quiet curiosity now rather than guarded suspicion. She studied the cabin in detail: the tools on the wall, the worn chair, the simple bed pushed against the far corner. Everything suggested a life built from necessity, not comfort. A life shaped by solitude. "Do you live alone?" she asked. "Yes." "For how long?" "Long enough." She understood the answer without pressing for more. People didn't choose this kind of isolation unless they were running from something or trying to rebuild from something broken. A gust of wind slammed against the door, rattling the latch. Ayoka jumped, but Elias didn't even turn his head. "It won't come loose," he assured her. "The wood's stronger than it looks." She nodded, pulling the blanket closer again. Her eyes drifted toward the bed across the room, then toward the wooden chair closer to the stove. She understood the arrangement without needing explanation. Elias was preparing to give her the warmest place in the cabin and take whatever remained for himself. "You should sleep too," she murmured. "I will," he answered. "After the fire's higher." She didn't argue. Exhaustion pulled her down again. She lay back, easing her head onto the folded blanket he had placed there earlier. Her eyes closed slowly this time, not from fear, but from the steady comfort of warmth and safety. Elias watched her breathing settle, then moved quietly around the room preparing for the night ahead, checking weapons, reinforcing the shutters, tightening the window latches. Not out of paranoia, but because he knew storms hid things as easily as they blocked them. When he finally sat in the chair, the fire reflected off the edge of his knife, the only sharp sound in the room the slow crackle of burning wood. Ayoka slept with less tension in her face, the first moment of peace she had likely known in days. Outside, the storm howled. Inside, the cabin held steady. And for the first time in a long while, Elias felt the shift of a responsibility he had not expected, one that anchored him more firmly than the land he lived on. The fire dimmed to a low, orange glow by the time the storm reached its strongest point. Wind pushed against the cabin with the weight of a moving wall, each gust rolling across the valley with a deep, steady force. Elias sat awake in the wooden chair, his arms resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the small window as flakes of snow hit the glass in rapid bursts. Ayoka slept only a few feet away, curled beneath layers of blankets, her breathing quiet and even. He listened to the rise and fall of the storm, trying to judge how long it would last. Travel would be impossible until daylight, maybe longer. He considered the tracks that had led her to the river, tracks the storm was now burying beneath fresh snow. If anyone had followed her into the valley, their trail was gone. For now, the weather offered a shield stronger than anything he could build. Still, he checked the door once more to be sure the latch held firm. Years of living alone in the frontier taught him that safety depended on small habits, quiet checks, steady routines, never assuming the night would pass without trouble. Ayoka shifted beneath the blankets, letting out a faint sound of discomfort. Elias looked over quickly, her brow furrowed with pain, and her breathing hitched as if she were returning to the memory of whatever had driven her into the river. He moved closer, lifting one edge of the blanket just enough to check the bandage on her arm. The wound was no longer bleeding, but the skin around it remained swollen. He laid the blanket back quietly, careful not to wake her. But her eyes opened anyway, reacting to the small change in warmth. "You're all right," he said softly, "just checking the bandage." She blinked several times, adjusting to the dim light. The tension in her shoulders eased when she recognized him. Her gaze moved around the cabin, then settled on the window where shadows from the fire flickered against the wall. "The storm," she whispered. "It's not stopping tonight," Elias said. "You'll need to stay until morning." She accepted the reality with a nod, though her body remained tense under the blankets. Trust came slowly. Elias didn't expect more than the cautious calm she managed now. Her voice was quiet when she spoke again. "I didn't mean to bring trouble to your home." "You didn't," Elias answered. "You were alone and hurt. That's enough reason to help." Ayoka studied him, searching for any sign that he resented her presence. Instead, she found a man who kept his emotions carefully contained, but whose actions never wavered from steady, grounded care. The wind struck the cabin again, shaking snow from the roof. Ayoka flinched. Elias noticed the reaction and shifted the chair a little closer to her, not touching her, but making sure she wasn't facing the noise alone. It calmed her breathing slightly. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "I couldn't see them anymore," she said quietly. "The men. When I ran, I didn't look back." Elias listened without pushing for more. Her voice carried relief that they hadn't followed, but also fear that they might still be somewhere out there. She continued speaking, choosing her words carefully. "They were angry, not because of anything I did. They wanted something I didn't have. I didn't stay long enough to understand their reason." Elias's jaw tightened. A senseless attack meant a greater danger. Men who acted without cause rarely stopped after one attempt. He needed to know in more detail. "Were they traveling fast or hunting slow?" he asked gently. Ayoka shook her head. "Fast, like they had urgency." That answered the question. They wouldn't linger in the storm. They had been moving with purpose, not patrolling or scouting. Whatever they wanted, they weren't staying long enough to search the entire valley. The information eased one of the questions lingering in Elias's mind. But another remained. Why Ayoka had been alone in the first place. She sensed the unspoken question and addressed it without waiting. "I was trying to reach my people," she said. "I left my camp at sunrise. I was supposed to return before dark." A pause followed, small but heavy. "They don't know what happened to me." Elias nodded. "The storm would hide you from anyone trying to follow. They'll search when it clears." She lowered her eyes, absorbing the reassurance. She was strong, cautious, deliberate, traits that kept people alive in the frontier. That strength had momentarily faltered at the river, but now that her body was warm and her breath steady, she regained a quiet presence that told him she wasn't someone who broke easily. Elias added more wood to the stove, raising the heat in the cabin. Ayoka watched the sparks climb up the chimney. The fire's glow reflected in her eyes, softening the sharpness of her fear. "You should sleep again," Elias said. She hesitated. "And you?" "I'll rest in the chair," he said. "I'm used to it." Her gaze moved to his face, noticing the shadows under his eyes. "You're cold," she said. "Your clothes are still damp." Elias glanced at the drying clothes hung beside the stove. "I've had worse." The answer wasn't meant to impress her, just the truth of a man who had spent too many nights in harsh places. She seemed to accept it. She lay back slowly, but before closing her eyes, she glanced toward the corner where Elias kept his rifle. She didn't ask about it. She simply wanted to understand if danger was something he expected regularly. He followed her eyes. "The rifle stays loaded," he said. That's the rule of this valley. Not because of you. Ayoka settled into the blankets again. Her breathing deepened, slow and steady. Elias remained awake, watching the door, the fire, and the shadows that moved across the cabin walls. The storm continued, but it no longer rattled Ayoka. Exhaustion pulled her into sleep, this time without fear chasing her through it. Elias sat watch through the night, the responsibility settling over him with a weight he didn't resist. Inside the cabin, two strangers rested under the same roof, one recovering strength, the other guarding the quiet that protected them both. And outside, the storm erased every trace of the world that had tried to harm her. The storm eased only slightly by dawn. Snow still drifted across the valley in long white sheets, but the violent gust had softened into steady wind. Elias had dozed off for only a few minutes at a time, waking each time the fire shifted or the cabin creaked. When the light began to seep through the frosted window, he rose carefully from the chair and added more wood to the stove. Ayoka stirred beneath the blankets. Her eyes opened slowly, clearer than the night before, no longer clouded by shock. She pushed herself up on one elbow, testing her strength. Elias turned toward her, noticing the tension in her jaw as she moved. "Try slow," he said. "Your body's still stiff from the cold." She followed the advice, easing herself upright. Her arm throbbed beneath the bandage, but she endured the pain without complaint. Her gaze shifted toward the window, where early light blurred against thick frost. "It's morning," she whispered. "Storm hasn't passed," Elias replied, "but it's calmer." Ayoka looked around the cabin as if assessing what she could manage now that her mind was clearer. Her posture held more steadiness than the night before. She wasn't fully recovered, but her breathing was stronger and the tremors had faded. Elias brought her a cup of warm water. "Drink. You lost more strength than you think." She accepted it, her hand steady this time. After a few sips, she lowered the cup and studied him with quiet curiosity. "You didn't sleep," she said. "Not much." "Why?" Elias shrugged lightly. "Storm was too loud, and someone needed to keep the fire going." She held his gaze a moment longer, recognizing there was more he wasn't saying. He avoided discussing the responsibility he felt, not wanting to make her feel indebted or uneasy. But she understood anyway. A soft crackle came from the stove. Elias knelt to adjust the coals, giving her a moment to look around the cabin without feeling watched. She examined the tools hung on the wall, the neatly folded clothes near the bed, the stacked firewood, the saddlebags by the door. Every detail confirmed that he lived simply, but with precision. He didn't waste, didn't decorate, didn't keep anything he didn't need. A man surviving the land rather than inviting it. Ayoka turned her eyes back to him. "You said you've lived here a long time." "I have." "Why this place?" Elias paused. Understanding the question held more weight now that her mind was clear. He sat back in the chair, steadying his thoughts before speaking. "It's quiet," he said finally. "Quiet was the only thing that made sense after losing people I cared about." Ayoka absorbed the answer without asking for details. She knew loss, its silence, its weight, its ability to reshape a person into someone who doesn't expect anything from the world anymore. Understanding passed between them in a way that didn't need further explanation. She then asked the question that lingered inside her since she first opened her eyes in the cabin. "Are you alone by choice?" Elias hesitated, but not from discomfort. He considered the truth carefully. "At first, I thought distance would spare me from more grief," he said. "Later, I learned I didn't know how to return to anything else." Ayoka lowered her gaze, tracing the rim of the tin cup with her thumb. She wasn't afraid to hear the truth. She simply related to it. Her life had also shifted into constant movement, threats, and caution. She understood how a person could drift into isolation without planning to. She set the cup aside. "I left my people because I thought the path was safe. I wanted to reach a trading camp before evening. But the men," she stopped, steadying her breath. "They weren't from any tribe near here. They carried rifles. They blocked the road and tried to pull me down from my horse." Elias felt the familiar tension return to his shoulders. "Did they say anything?" "No. Only reach for me. One grabbed my arm. I fought. I broke free. Her hand brushed the bruise on her forehead. I ran until I couldn't see them. The missing pieces became clearer. Why she had been alone near the river, why her clothing was torn, why she looked over her shoulder every time the cabin creaked. She had not simply fled danger. She had fought it before the river forced the rest of the night upon her. She lifted her eyes again. You think they'll come here? No, Elias said firmly. They were moving quickly. They weren't searching the valley. And now the storm's hiding everything. His certainty eased the fear she tried to hide. She relaxed into the blankets with a slow breath. He stood and prepared a small meal. Bread warmed near the fire, dried meat softened in broth. When he placed the bowl in her hands, she accepted it without hesitation this time. Hunger pushed past everything else, and the food helped steady her strength. Her eyes lifted as she ate. Thank you. Elias didn't reply with words. He simply nodded once, which she recognized as his way of acknowledging that he didn't expect thanks. A long pause settled between them, but it wasn't tense. It was quiet, shaped by two people trying to understand the edges of each other's worlds. Ayoka lifted her head again. You saved me. That is not a small thing. You were in the river, Elias said. Anyone would have done the same. She studied him closely. Not anyone. He didn't argue. He let the silence fill the space again, but this time it carried mutual respect rather than uncertainty. The wind eased outside, dropping into a steady whisper that brushed against the cabin walls. Ayoka looked toward the window once more. When the storm clears, she said softly, I need to find my people. We'll look for tracks when the light's better, Elias replied. I'll guide you as far as the valley edge. You'll help me reach them? Yes. Something shifted in her eyes, a mixture of relief and a quiet gratitude she didn't yet know how to express. Elias didn't push her to. She rested against the wall of blankets, warmed by the fire and steadied by food. Her breathing slowed again, but not with exhaustion, with clarity. For the first time since she arrived, she looked at the small cabin not as a place she was trapped, but as a shelter in which she could catch her breath long enough to continue. Elias returned to the chair, keeping watch over the fading storm. Ayoka rested in the warmth she had not expected to survive to see. And between them, an unspoken understanding settled into the quiet, a fragile connection built from survival, honesty, and the slow rebuilding of trust. The morning passed slowly as the storm weakened, leaving behind thick drifts of snow that covered the valley in uneven layers. The wind had settled into a calmer rhythm, but the cold remained sharp. Elias stepped outside for a moment, testing the ground, scanning the tree line, checking for anything unusual. His boots sank deep into the snow, and the landscape around the cabin looked untouched. No prints, no movement, nothing but the pale stretch of frozen land. He returned inside and shut the door quietly. Ayoka sat up as he entered, her posture straighter than before, the color returning to her cheeks. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders, but no longer clung to it out of fear. She watched him with alertness, sensing something in his expression even before he spoke. It's clear enough to move around, Elias said, but the snow is deep. It'll slow anyone who tries to approach. Ayoka nodded, absorbing the information carefully. She studied his face, searching for anything he wasn't saying. Elias didn't hide concerns well. He simply held them behind his steady manner. She could sense that he had seen something that made him cautious, even if he hadn't said it aloud. Did you find tracks? She asked. No, Elias answered. Storm covered everything. That's good. It means you weren't followed. Ayoka lowered her eyes briefly in relief. The idea that the men might return had lingered in her thoughts all night. Hearing they had no trail to follow allowed her lungs to fill more freely. Elias moved toward the stove and began preparing the morning fire. As he worked, Ayoka watched the way he shifted his weight when he bent down. His right leg was stiff, something she hadn't noticed clearly the night before. You're injured, she said quietly. Old wound, Elias replied. It acts up in the cold. She tilted her head slightly. From a fight. From the past, he said, not elaborating. She didn't push, but she understood. People didn't live alone in the frontier without carrying old wounds, physical or otherwise. The cabin warmed again, and Ayoka tried standing for the first time since the rescue. She placed one foot on the ground, steadied herself with the wall, and took a slow breath. Pain flared in her arm, but she held steady. Elias turned when he heard the slight shift of wood beneath her feet. "Careful," he said, stepping closer. "You're still weak." "I need to move," Ayoka replied. "My body grows stiff if I stay still." He nodded and watched her take a few small steps around the room. Her balance wavered, but she kept her back straight, determined not to show vulnerability she didn't need to. Elias didn't interfere, allowing her the space to reclaim her strength. After a few minutes, she sat again, breathing harder than before, but steadier. "What will you do now?" she asked. "First, make sure the valley's safe," Elias replied. "Then take you back to your people." She looked at him with a mix of appreciation and uncertainty. "You don't have to take me. Your home has already carried enough trouble because of me." "It's not trouble," Elias said plainly. "And you shouldn't travel alone until we know the area is clear." Ayoka considered his words, realizing he had already decided to see her safely home. She didn't argue. There was no pride or stubbornness in her decision, only respect for the reality surrounding her. A sudden sound broke the quiet. A horse neighing, distant but unmistakable. Elias's head snapped toward the window. Ayoka's breath caught. The sound wasn't close enough to signal immediate danger, but it didn't belong to his horse. He knew that much instantly. Elias crossed the cabin in 2 steps and unhooked his rifle from the wall. His movements weren't rushed, but deliberate and controlled. Ayoka rose to her feet, ignoring the pain in her arm, her eyes fixed on the door. "Stay behind the stove," Elias said quietly. She obeyed without hesitation. Her body pressed against the wall, alert and ready. He cracked the shutter open just enough to see outside. For several long seconds, he remained still, studying the tree line and the snow-covered ridge. Then he relaxed slightly and lowered the rifle. "It's all right," he said. "Just a stray horse. No rider. Looks like it wandered off in the storm." Ayoka exhaled, tension draining from her shoulders. The fear had risen too quickly, a reminder of how near danger felt even when it wasn't there. "Are you sure it's alone?" she asked. "Yes," Elias said. "If someone were nearby, I'd see tracks." She stepped out from behind the stove, steadying her breath. "Storms saved me twice," she murmured. Elias didn't disagree. He moved to the table and began preparing gear, checking his saddlebags, laying out fresh bandages, sharpening a small knife. Ayoka watched him, recognizing the silent message. He was preparing for a day that might challenge both of them. "Why are you helping me?" she asked suddenly, the question finally surfacing now that the danger had been acknowledged. Elias paused, but didn't look up yet. He considered the truth, not the easy version, not the polite version. "Because you needed someone," he said, "and I know what it feels like when there's no one." Ayoka's throat tightened at the honesty in his voice. She lowered her gaze, touched by a sincerity she rarely encountered. "You're not as alone as you believe," she said softly. Elias didn't respond. He simply finished preparing the gear and set it aside. The wind outside settled into a slow rhythm, no longer rattling the cabin. Ayoka returned to her place near the fire, her body steadier, her resolve clearer. Elias sat across from her, resting the rifle against his leg. The storm had passed, but the world outside was shifting, carrying traces of danger and responsibility neither of them could ignore. A fragile bond had formed in the silence, stronger now that both had begun revealing the truths they carried. And for the first time since she arrived, Ayoka didn't feel like a visitor waiting to leave. She felt like someone whose presence mattered. The stray horse lingered near the tree line for a long while, pawing at the snow and shaking its mane as if trying to rid itself of the storm's remnants. Elias watched it through the narrow gap in the shutter, studying its condition. The animal was exhausted but unharmed, its saddle intact, the reins dragging loosely behind. That detail told him more than the tracks ever could. The rider had lost control in the storm, or the horse had been abandoned in haste. Either way, it confirmed something he had suspected since the night Ayoka arrived. Danger had passed through the valley more recently than he would have liked. He closed the shutter and turned back to the room. Ayoka stood near the fire, her posture straight despite the ache in her arm. Her eyes held a steadiness that hadn't been there before. Fear replaced by alertness, and alertness shaped now by resolve. "Is the horse harmless?" she asked. "For now," Elias said. "But its presence means someone rode close to the cabin. We need to move carefully." Ayoka nodded, absorbing the information without panic. She wrapped the blanket tighter and stepped forward. "We should find where it came from." Elias considered her words. She wasn't simply trying to protect herself. She was thinking ahead, understanding that anything left unsolved in this valley might return later. He respected that clarity. Still, her strength was limited. "You can walk, but not far," he said. "Your body needs more time." She lifted her chin slightly. "I won't slow you down." Elias didn't challenge her determination. Instead, he gathered his gear, saddlebags, tools, rope, and checked his rifle once more. Ayoka watched him assemble each piece with practiced precision, noticing the way he double-checked his ammunition and the tightness of each strap. He wasn't preparing for a journey. He was preparing for the unknown. Outside, the storm had left the world still and pale, with long shadows cast by the morning light. When Elias opened the cabin door, a blast of cold air swept through, carrying the clean scent of fresh snow. Ayoka stepped out beside him, steady but cautious. The stray horse lifted its head at their approach, but didn't flee. It looked relieved to see humans again, as if wandering alone through a storm had worn down whatever fear it once had. Elias moved toward it slowly, speaking in low, steady tones. The horse allowed him to take the reins. Its breathing was heavy, but its eyes were clear, no signs of injury or distress beyond exhaustion. Ayoka circled to the animal's other side, brushing snow from its coat. "This saddle," she said quietly, "it's from traders, not the men who chased me." Elias examined the stitching, the worn leather straps, the simple design. She was right. The saddle belonged to someone who traveled often and carried goods, not to violent riders who moved with urgency. "Then its owner may be nearby," Elias said. Ayoka's expression shifted, worry and compassion mixing together. Traders rarely travel alone. If one horse had returned without its rider, it meant the rider was either sheltering somewhere in the valley or lying beneath the snow. Elias seemed to read her thoughts. "We'll check the ridge," he said. "If he's alive, he won't last long in this cold." Ayoka nodded, tightening her cloak of blankets around her shoulders. They left the cabin and crossed the clearing, moving carefully through knee-deep snow. Elias guided the stray horse with one hand while scanning the landscape with sharp, deliberate movements. Ayoka stayed near him, stepping where he stepped to avoid hidden ice beneath the surface. As they reached the ridge overlooking the valley, Ayoka paused, catching her breath. Elias glanced at her, noting the strain in her arm. "You're right." She inhaled deeply. "I'll manage." Her determination was genuine, not forced. Still, Elias adjusted their pace, making it appear natural rather than protective. It was clear she didn't want to be treated as fragile, and he respected that instinct. They followed the ridge until Elias spotted a faint indentation in the snow, a disrupted patch that didn't match the natural drift patterns. He knelt, brushing away the surface layer. Footprints, deep ones. Someone had walked through the storm, fighting the wind with uneven steps. Ayoka crouched beside him. "They're recent. Within the last few hours," Elias confirmed. Someone tried to reach higher ground. The prints led toward a cluster of large rocks half buried under snow. Elias approached cautiously, rifle in hand. Ayoka followed, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. When they rounded the rocks, they found a man slumped against one of them, half buried and unconscious. His clothes matched the saddle on the stray horse, simple trader garments, layered for long travel. His face was pale, his lips cracked from cold, his fingers curled tightly around an empty water skin. "He's alive," Ayoka said quickly, kneeling beside him and placing her hand near his chest. "But weak." Elias lowered his rifle and moved to help, checking the man's pulse. It was faint but present. He didn't make it to shelter in time, Elias said. If we leave him here, he won't last another hour. Ayoka reached for her blanket and laid it gently across the stranger's chest. We take him back, she said. He needs warmth. Elias nodded, but weighed the situation carefully. Bringing another injured person into the cabin meant more responsibility, more uncertainty, and more risk. Still, he couldn't ignore that this man had fought to survive the same storm that had nearly killed Ayoka. Help me lift him, Elias said. Ayoka moved into position without hesitation, her earlier exhaustion tempered by urgency. Together, they raised the man enough for Elias to hoist him across the stray horse's back. Ayoka steadied the animal while Elias secured the unconscious trader in place. They returned to the cabin slowly, their steps measured, their movements coordinated. As they approached the door, Ayoka glanced toward Elias with a quiet realization. People come to this valley without meaning to, she said, but they rarely leave without help. Elias looked at her, the weight of the moment settling between them. That seems to be the way of it. Inside, the fire still burned warmly. They laid the unconscious man near the stove and began tending to him with the same care Elias had shown Ayoka. The space that had once held silence now held the breath and weight of 3 lives, pulled together by the storm, each carrying a fragment of danger or burden. Ayoka stepped back, watching Elias check the man's pulse, adjust the blankets, and warm his hands. She realized something she had sensed the night before but had not yet put into words. Elias didn't just rescue people. He restored the part of himself he thought was gone, one small act of protection at a time. The valley had changed in a single night. So had the meaning of the cabin, and neither Elias nor Ayoka could ignore the new path unfolding between them. The stranger lay motionless near the stove, wrapped in layers of blankets that slowly absorbed the heat rising from the fire. His breathing was shallow but steady, the warmth pulling him back from the edge of collapse. Elias checked his pulse again, counting each faint beat. Ayoka watched from beside the table, her expression focused, no longer clouded by fear, but sharpened by concern and curiosity. The cabin felt smaller now, not from discomfort, but from the presence of 3 lives bound temporarily by the same storm. Elias rose to his feet and stepped back, giving the injured man space to breathe. Ayoka moved closer, kneeling beside the blankets to study the stranger more clearly. He is young, she said quietly. Not much older than 20, Elias agreed. Traveling alone in winter without enough supplies. Ayoka touched the edge of the blanket near the man's shoulder. What would bring him through this valley? Elias considered her question carefully. The valley was remote, not a common path unless someone was avoiding the main routes, or being chased away from them. He may have followed a trade route and drifted off course, Elias said, or something forced him into the storm. Ayoka nodded, but did not fully accept either answer. Her instincts stayed alert. She remembered the urgency of the men who had chased her. She remembered the fear of being hunted. She understood how easily purpose and danger could tangle. She glanced to Elias. Do you think he saw them? The men who struck me. Elias held her gaze for a moment, weighing the question. She needed assurance, not empty comfort. It's possible, he said honestly, but nothing on him looks like he was attacked. No bruises, no blood, no torn clothing. If he faced trouble, it wasn't recent. Ayoka accepted this, though her concern lingered. She rose from the floor and wrapped her blanket around her shoulders. The rest had restored some of her strength, but the injury in her arms still pulsed with a steady ache. Elias noticed how she favored her uninjured side. Sit, he said gently. I'll check the bandage. She resisted for a heartbeat, then allowed him to guide her toward the chair. He unwrapped the cloth carefully, inspecting the wound. The swelling had gone down, the edges were cleaner. Her skin warmed under the stove's heat, and her breathing stayed calm as he cleaned the cut and applied a fresh wrapping. You heal quickly, Elias said. I've had worse, Ayoka replied, though her eyes softened at the quiet care he gave. Outside, the wind shifted direction, carrying a faint echo through the valley. Elias paused and listened. The sound was distant but familiar, the creak of ice shifting beneath the riverbank. No voices, no horses, no sign of approaching danger. Ayoka followed his gaze toward the window. "You keep listening," she said, "even when you pretend not to." "It's habit," Elias replied. "This land punishes anyone who stops paying attention." She studied him with renewed understanding. How he moved, how he watched, how he prepared without announcing it. He wasn't guarding only himself anymore. He was guarding the cabin, the stranger on the floor, and her. The unconscious man stirred suddenly, his eyelids fluttering as if fighting to pull himself fully into awareness. Ayoka stepped closer instinctively. Elias crouched beside the man, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. "You're safe," Elias said. "You're inside, out of the storm." The trader's breathing quickened before he finally opened his eyes. Confusion washed over his face as he scanned the cabin, then fixed on Elias, then on Ayoka. His voice came out hoarse and weak. Where am I?" "In my cabin," Elias said. "Your horse wandered here. We found you in the snow." The man blinked, trying to hold onto the memory. I was riding south. The wind knocked me off the trail. My horse bolted." He looked down at the blankets, at his stiff fingers, at the melting snow around him. Then his eyes shifted again to Ayoka. He stared for a moment longer than necessary, not out of suspicion, but in recognition that he wasn't the only one rescued from the storm. Ayoka bowed her head slightly, acknowledging his presence without stepping closer. "What's your name?" Elias asked. "Thomas," the young man whispered. "Thomas Ward." The name struck Elias with a sharp stillness. Ayoka noticed his shoulders tense, though his face remained composed. Elias didn't fully react, only absorbed the information carefully, quietly. "You came from the north?" Elias asked. Thomas nodded. "There's trouble on the road. Men chasing anything they want. Traders, travelers, anyone." Ayoka stiffened, recognizing the threat instantly. "What kind of men?" Elias asked. "They carried rifles," Thomas said. "Moved fast. Didn't speak much. They attacked a wagon near the ridge. I ran while they were distracted." Ayoka exchanged a quick look with Elias, her pulse rising. The pieces aligned. Not perfectly, but close enough to confirm the danger still lingered in the region. "Did they follow you?" Elias asked. "I don't know," Thomas murmured. "I didn't look back." The fire crackled, filling the room with a brief silence. Elias exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment grounding him. The valley was no longer shielded by the storm alone. It was now touched by the path of men who had attacked both Ayoka and Thomas. But panic did not settle in the cabin. Elias's mind shifted into focus, gathering information, forming a plan. Ayoka saw it in the way he adjusted his stance, in the way his hand hovered near his rifle, not out of fear, but readiness. "We'll keep you both safe," Elias said, his voice steady. Ayoka looked at him, hearing more in his words than simple reassurance. He wasn't promising safety through walls or fire. He was promising his presence, his watch, his willingness to confront whatever approached. Thomas lay back down, exhausted. Ayoka stepped toward the stove, adding another log to the fire. Elias watched her move, noticing how naturally she began to share the space, how her actions shifted from survival to cooperation. The cabin, once a place of solitude, had become a shelter layered with responsibility, trust, and unspoken reliance. Outside, the valley fell quiet again, too quiet. Inside, three people breathed the same warm air, each carrying a fragment of danger from the world beyond the cabin door. And for the first time, Elias understood that the storm had not only forced them together, it had prepared them for what would come next. Thomas drifted in and out of sleep while the fire worked steadily to warm his frozen limbs. Ayoka remained near the stove, her eyes moving between the injured trader and Elias, who paced the short length of the cabin with a measured, controlled focus. The pieces of a new threat had settled clearly in his mind. Ayoka's attackers and the men Thomas described were likely the same group. Their movements were too swift, too aggressive, and too careless to be anything but dangerous. But the storm had changed the land. The snow had buried tracks, slowed movement, and muffled sound. If the men were still in the valley, they would have left signs by now. The fact that none appeared meant they had either passed through entirely or were further south, searching for other victims. Ayoka watched Elias stop near the window, his hand resting lightly against the shutter. He didn't lift it. He just listened to the wind, the occasional crack of settling ice, and the stillness that followed. "You think they're close," she said. "I think they move fast," Elias answered. "And fast riders don't stay long in one place." Ayoka approached, the blanket brushing against the wooden floor. "They hurt me without reason. They attacked Thomas's wagon. Why do they travel at all if they want nothing but trouble?" Elias considered her question. "Some men cause harm because they can, because no one stands in their way." Her brows tightened slightly. "And if they come this way again, then I stand in their way." Ayoka looked at him for a long moment, absorbing the steady conviction in his voice. He didn't speak loudly or with bravado. He spoke with the clarity of someone who had lived through violence and knew exactly what he was capable of when necessary. Thomas stirred again, groaning as he tried to sit up. Ayoka went to his side and helped him lean against the wall. He blinked several times, still trying to shake the fog from his mind. How long? How long was I out?" he asked. "A few hours," Elias said. "You're safe here until you can stand." Thomas swallowed hard, then looked at Ayoka. Recognition lit in his eyes, not of her identity, but of shared danger. "You saw them too," he said. Ayoka nodded. "They chased me. They struck me. They would not have stopped if I hadn't escaped." "Then they're still moving south," Thomas murmured. "They weren't after goods. They were looking for people traveling alone." Elias listened in silence, letting the information fall into place. The men weren't scouts. They weren't raiders. They were opportunists roaming without restraint, taking what they wanted and leaving destruction behind. They didn't linger because their purpose was simple: strike, take, disappear. But their path had crossed the valley, and that alone made them a threat. "We should leave before they circle back," Thomas said weakly. "You're not riding anywhere," Elias replied. "Not until you can walk without falling." Thomas didn't argue. He understood his condition well enough. Ayoka wrapped another blanket around his shoulders, then stepped back toward the center of the room. Elias turned from the window and faced them both. "When the storm clears, we'll move," Elias said. "First to Ayoka's people. They need to know what's happening. After that, I'll take Thomas to the next safe crossing." Thomas looked surprised. "You take me all that way? Why?" "Because leaving you here alone isn't an option," Elias said simply. Ayoka breathed out slowly, her shoulders relaxing. Despite the danger outside, the path ahead was becoming clear. She shifted closer to the fire, warming her hands. Elias watched her for a moment, noting the strength she had regained and the calm she carried now. She was no longer the terrified woman he had dragged from the river. She stood straighter, spoke with certainty, and met danger with unbroken resolve. But one question remained, something unspoken that lingered between them since the morning. "Are you well enough to ride by tomorrow?" Elias asked. Ayoka considered her injuries carefully. Her arm still throbbed, but she could move it. Her legs were steady. Rest had restored most of her strength. "Yes," she said, "I can ride." Elias nodded once. Her answer was not just about physical readiness. It meant she trusted him enough to travel beside him. Thomas watched the exchange with quiet awareness. He wasn't blind to the shift between them, nor to the shared steadiness that had grown over the last day. He cleared his throat. "If we leave together, we'll have a better chance." Elias glanced at him. "We will." The wind outside softened into a steady whistle, windows humming faintly as snow slid from the roof. The storm was giving way to a calmer sky. Soon the valley would open again, revealing whatever tracks had been buried and whatever dangers remained. Ayoka stood beside Elias, looking toward the door as if she could already see the journey waiting beyond it. "I'm ready," she said. Elias looked at her, the faintest trace of something unspoken in his eyes. Not doubt, not fear, but a quiet acknowledgement of the bond forming between them. A bond built on survival, trust, and the steady care they had offered each other without expectation. "We leave at first light," Elias said. Ayoka nodded, a calm certainty settling in her expression. Thomas lay back against the wall, closing his eyes with relief. Elias stoked the fire, preparing the cabin for one last night before the path ahead opened. Inside the small wooden walls, the air carried a sense of purpose. Three strangers bound by danger had become a single unit, steady, aligned, ready. When dawn arrived, they would face the world outside together, and whatever waited in the valley would meet a group stronger than the storm that brought them together. Dawn rose over the valley with a pale, steady light, the sky washed clean by the passing storm. The snow had settled into thick layers that glowed faintly under the early sun, and a quiet stillness hung over the land, a calm that felt rare after days filled with tension and survival. Elias stepped outside first, his boots sinking into the snow as he scanned the horizon. No fresh tracks, no movement. The land was empty except for the quiet trail their own preparations were about to carve. Inside the cabin, Ayoka tightened the laces of her deerskin clothing, adjusting the fresh bandage around her arm. She moved with a steadiness that had not been present when Elias first carried her into the room. She had regained her strength, and with it came a quiet determination. She breathed deeply, grounding herself in the reality that she would soon return to her people, not as someone broken or pursued, but as someone who had survived. Thomas sat near the stove, wrapped in blankets, but strong enough to sit upright. His color had returned, though his limbs remained stiff. When Elias re-entered the cabin, Thomas lifted his eyes with a look of gratitude that needed no words. "You'll manage the ride," Elias said, "but we'll keep a slow pace." Thomas nodded. "Slow is fine. I owe you both more than I can say." Ayoka approached him and rested a light hand on his shoulder. "Stay close to us," she said. "The cold may weaken you again." Thomas's expression softened. "I will." Elias packed the final supplies into the saddlebags, making sure they had enough water, dried meat, and blankets for the journey. Ayoka stepped outside while he worked, letting the cold air brush against her skin. She looked toward the distant ridge where her people would be waiting. A sense of relief, layered with anticipation, filled her chest. Elias joined her outside, leading his horse and the trader's recovered horse. Ayoka met his eyes, and for a brief moment, they simply stood together in silence, recognizing the weight of what had passed and what was ahead. "You're ready," Elias said. "I am," Ayoka replied, "and I will show them that I survived." Elias nodded, admiring the calm strength in her voice. "We'll reach them by midday if the snow holds." Thomas emerged slowly from the cabin, leaning slightly on the doorframe for balance before stepping forward. Elias helped him mount his horse, securing the blankets around him. Once the trader was settled, Elias looked to Ayoka. "Take the lead," he said. "You know the land better." Ayoka guided her horse forward, her movements steady even with the lingering ache in her arm. Elias rode beside her, Thomas following just behind. They wove through the valley, the horses moving carefully through the snow. The sun warmed the air just enough to soften the edges of the cold. As they traveled, the silence between Elias and Ayoka held a new shape, no longer fragile or uncertain, but grounded and real. Every so often she glanced toward him, noticing how he scanned the land, how he placed himself between her and any open space that might carry danger. It wasn't a gesture of control. It was protection, offered freely and without expectation. Halfway through the valley, Ayoka slowed her horse and lifted her hand. Elias immediately halted beside her. She scanned the ridge ahead, her eyes sharp and steady. "There," she said quietly. A group of riders appeared on the horizon, emerging from behind a grove of snow-covered trees. Their pace was slow and deliberate. When they reached the clearing, Ayoka recognized the patterns on their clothing, the way their horses were adorned, the familiar shape of the spears carried upright. She exhaled with relief. "My people." Elias saw the tension leave her shoulders. He watched the riders approach, their expressions shifting from caution to recognition as they spotted Ayoka. They called out in their own language, urgency mixed with joy. When they reached her, two women and an older man dismounted immediately, embracing her with trembling hands. "You are alive," one of the women said, her voice tight with emotion. "We searched all night." Ayoka held them close, her forehead resting against the older man's shoulder. "I survived because of him," she said, turning toward Elias. The riders followed her gaze. Their eyes softened, gratitude evident despite the hardened caution of frontier life. Elias dipped his head slightly, acknowledging their thanks without stepping forward or intruding on their reunion. One of the men approached Elias with a firm nod. "You protected one of ours. You will not be forgotten." Elias didn't search for praise, but the sincerity in the man's voice left an unexpected warmth in his chest. Thomas was helped down from his horse by two younger riders, who steadied him and wrapped a fresh blanket around his shoulders. They spoke with him briefly, then assured Elias they would take him to the nearest camp and send word to any traders searching for him. Ayoka approached Elias again, her steps slower this time, not from pain, but from the weight of what she wanted to say. She stood close enough that the others could hear, but her gaze was for Elias alone. "You carried me from the river," she said. "You gave me shelter. You listened when I could not find the right words. I will not forget any of it." Elias felt something shift inside him, a quiet realization that the time spent together had meant more than simple survival. "You're safe now," he said. "That's what matters." Ayoka looked into his eyes, steady and unwavering. "You gave me more than safety." He didn't speak, but he didn't look away. She reached out and touched his hand. Just a brief, warm gesture that carried every unspoken emotion between them. "If you ever come to the ridge," she said softly, "my people will welcome you. And so will I." Elias nodded once, his voice lower than before. "Maybe one day." Ayoka smiled, a small, genuine expression that held no fear, no hesitation. She turned toward her people, who guided her onto a horse and surrounded her with protective calm. Before leaving, she looked back one last time. Elias lifted his hand in a quiet farewell. She returned the gesture, her expression steady, grateful, and warm. As the group rode toward the ridge, Elias remained still, watching until they disappeared behind the trees. Thomas waved weakly as the riders took him to safety. The valley fell quiet again. Elias stood beside his horse, the winter air brushing against him, and for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt peaceful. He turned toward his cabin, ready to return, but now the land felt different, less like a place of hiding, and more like a place where new paths could begin. Ayoka was safe. Thomas was saved, and Elias walked back through the snow with a quiet certainty warming his chest. A life spent alone did not have to stay that way. The story had come to an end, but not the bond they had formed. One built on survival, trust, and the gentle strength of two people who had found comfort under the same roof, even if only for a night. A warm, final ending, without fear, without unresolved questions, settled over the valley as Elias lifted his gaze to the quiet sky and felt, for the first time in years, that the world still held a place for him.